Hi, so in this session, Data the Senses, we're going to explore how we might use all of our senses, sight, but also taste, touch, smell, sound, to become better data communicators. And we're going to do that in two modes. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about how sensory experiences can be a data source as sensory inputs. And then we're going to talk about how sensory experiences can represent data as sensory outputs. So on the theme of sensory inputs, we thought it would be fun to introduce ourselves in a multi-sensory way. So to share some sensory data points that tell you something about us as people. So I'm Jordan, and my first sensory data point is a sound that represents me. And let's see if you can guess what it is.
Some sort of mating call?
Yeah, it's actually an elk that I recorded off of my porch here in Colorado. All right, Max, what about you? If you were a sound, what would you be?
Very cool. I also chose something kind of animal nature-y. So mine would be of cicadas and Japanese fern chimes.
Soothing, I like it.
And if I were to choose a smell, it would be sort of in that warm vibe of vanilla cedary.
Awesome. If I were a smell, I would probably be something citrusy. Think about when you peel a clementine or an orange and then the smell lingers on your fingers and hands for a long time afterwards. Okay, so moving on to gesture or touch. So if I were a gesture, I mean, it would have to be probably something like this, something having to do with running, because that's a really big part of my identity. What about you, Max?
I think mine would be more of a touch sensation. So like imagine laying down in the grass when it's summer and having the sun rays beat down on you, or like a nice warm long hug from a friend. And in terms of taste, well, we both know how into taste I am. So I kind of got carried away and made a sort of taste radar signature. And I think mine would lean heavily on umami and sour. This is not tested, but this is just what I think would be my perfect taste ratio.
Very cool. Well, my taste ratio would definitely have to include sour, but also fatty or creamy. So probably plain full fat yogurt, which I eat pretty much every day. Awesome. Yeah. So now that you've gotten to know us as people through our senses, let's do an exercise that we can all join in together that continues to explore sensory inputs. So what we're going to do is Max is going to play along with us because we pre-recorded this, obviously, but at home you can do this as we're explaining it. So the first thing is to grab a nearby object, something you have at hand around you, hopefully something that's either tasty or smelly, maybe something that has kind of an interesting texture, or maybe that makes kind of an interesting sound when you play with it. So I'll give you a second to grab your object. Max, do you have yours ready to go?
I do. I came prepared, so I grabbed a yummy corn chip.
Awesome. Okay, so with your object, the first thing you're going to do is to look at it very closely. So using your eyes, observe it, and then just ask yourself, what do you see?
Well, I see a sort of curled rectangular shape. It's yellow, a little orange with brown speckles in it.
Excellent. Okay, so next thing in this exercise is to close your eyes and then take the object and rub it between your fingers. And as you do, I'm curious, what do you feel? But also, if you hold it up to your ear while you're rubbing it, what do you hear? And if you hold it up to your nose, do you smell anything?
Yeah, so it feels kind of gritty, the texture, and sounds like sandpaper a bit. And it leaves like a little oily, sandy film on my fingers. And when I smell it, it kind of smells like buttered popcorn. Very salty.
Awesome. Okay, so last step is you can go ahead and open your eyes now. And if you feel comfortable, touch the object with your tongue. And I know this might be weird depending on what your object is, but if you feel comfortable, you can also just kind of put it in your mouth. And as you do that, I'm curious, what do you taste, but also what do you feel, and do you hear anything?
So as I hoped, I tasted a delicious corn chip, and it was very crunchy and loud in my mouth. So I kind of drowned out a lot of what you were saying, but it was, yeah, gritty, as I said, kind of got like stuck in my teeth, and salty and corny.
Awesome. So these are all data points that you're sharing with me. Thank you for playing along, but I'm also curious, kind of what overarching takeaways did you have from doing this multisensory exercise?
Yeah, good question. Well, if the corn chip was a little stale, I realized that the texture wouldn't be as pleasurable. And even if the flavor was exactly the same, I probably wouldn't grab more until I had to, or if I was like starving. And the other thing was that like all these senses are harmonizing. So the taste, the texture, sound, smell, and color to really form this experience, but they're just acting in varying quantities and ratios. And we're actually not alone in this thought that all the senses are intertwined. W.J.T. Mitchell, who is a professor of art history, also was noted saying that all media are mixed media, and that there are no purely auditory, tactile, or olfactory media either. So continuing on this thread, we decided to do a data collection exercise also on taste, because eating is such a good example of all the senses at play. We challenged each other to collect sensory data during all of our meal times and see how the senses interact. So each day we assigned a different sense to analyze.
Yeah, so on the first day, we collected data on the texture of all the foods that we were eating. And for example, I actually focused on kind of the texture of my coffee or things I was drinking, which were very frothy and foamy on top. And I tried to write that down in words, but then also draw some sketches to try to capture that texture. And then the second day, we wrote down all of the colors of the foods that we ate. And for me, it was all just variations of brown. And so I had to come up with all kinds of different kinds of brown that I was seeing in the food that I was eating.
Yeah, and then the third day was sound. So I wrote things like coffee machine or spoon clinging onto metal bowl. And the fourth day was taste and smell. So when I was outside, I wrote things like loam, plants, various plants, and then also tried to figure out the taste ratios of the food I was eating. So how bitter, umami, fat, sour, sweet, etc. that it was. And after this taste collection exercise, we decided to analyze our data and make different representations of it. So here we are showing you just purely the visual form of it, because that's the easiest to share virtually. And this exercise was creating a sensory scroll where we both interpreted the prompt differently, as you can see. With Jordan's, you scroll horizontally, and mine a more squiggly up and down fashion. So you can see how we took different strategies for putting our data into spreadsheets just through this visual.
Yeah, and the strategy that I took was, even though each day focused on a different sense, I tried to put them all into one spreadsheet that shared all the same metrics. So things like how well I was able to represent the experience and what location I was in. And so I tried to collect the same data from all the different senses, which was kind of a challenge because they were all very different experiences.
And I did not do that challenge, which is why mine is up and down and has like 4 columns, such as like 4 tabs on a spreadsheet, which it really was. So I decided to narrow in on each sense and create metrics that I thought would either help me in future data representation exercises or could help me understand the experience of that day. But neither of the data entry methods that we took was right or wrong. They're just different. We had to focus on choosing what suited our goal and also what worked for us at the time. This was actually really difficult to accept because there's an infinite amount of possibilities and we wouldn't be able to express them all or even imagine them all. You might feel, if you were to do something like this, that something is lacking or frustrated with the results like us, but what you're really doing is just focusing on what is important to you at the time and calling attention to it. And it's a good reminder that all data is imperfect. And I would also pay anyone for $5 if they sincerely felt that their sensory data collection captured their sensory experience. We especially had to embrace imperfection because we're focusing on sensory data as data input, really trying to train these senses that we don't pay attention to as often. While we find that taking sensory data is just plain interesting and challenging, we also believe that it could help us become better designer of sensory experience, such as using data as output. And there's loads of projects that inspire us. And I think that Jordan has one that she wants to share.
Yeah. So I am an audiophile. I love sound, and there's actually a special word for representing data through sound that's called sonification. Hopefully, you all caught Sarah Lindsay's talk about sonification earlier in Outlier conference. And one example that I love in particular comes from Elias Elmquist, who's a PhD student, and he did an open space sonification, which represents properties of the different planets in our solar system through sound. So, for example, here is how he represented the strength of the gravitational field on various different planets. So this is using a very physical, dare I say even tactile metaphor of a ball being dropped and then bouncing on a given planet. So Mars, where there's weaker gravity, the ball kind of takes longer to bounce. And it's very physical and visceral. So even though this is a sound example, it is very physical and tangible, and they also used great visuals. So combining all of the senses, even though it's primarily focusing on sound. So Max, what about you? What's an example that inspires you?
Well, we both know how into smell and taste I am. So I was thrilled to find this example from Sissel Tolas, who is a smell expert. And she has done various smellscapes. And this one that I want to show you is in Berlin, where she is currently living. So for over the period of a year, she went to these 4 different neighborhoods in Berlin and actually collected scents from them to try to discover like what is the olfactory signature of each of these neighborhoods. And after a year, she distilled these into perfume and showed this in an exhibition. So one thing that I really like about this experience is that, well, it's interactive because people can smell it, and it plays a lot with people's memory and emotion because smell and also taste is very emotional and really like ignites the memory. And one thing that I think we can take away from this is just how we can use these different sensory modalities to play with emotion and memory, because while they may not represent specific data points, I think that they might be able to help us kind of know data in a more intuitive level. So when Jordan and I started collaborating, a big question was, how can we design sensory experiences?
Yeah, so we began our own explorations using sensory modalities as various outputs to represent data. And we began that experiment by picking a data set that was important to us. So we're going to share a case study that we did using the Air Quality Index, or AQI, which is a measure of several hazardous air pollutants. So things like ground level ozone and particulate matter, which are calibrated onto a scale that starts at 0, which would be totally safe and healthy, going up to 100, which is when things start to get unhealthy for most people. And it can even top out at 500, which would be extremely unhealthy air. And the AQI is often presented as this color scale, which is extremely visual. And it goes from green, being healthy, to yellow, to orange, to red, which is unhealthy, and then even into purple and maroon. So using this visual AQI scale as a starting point, we challenged ourselves to represent the scale and AQI data in all of the different sensory modalities. So here's some examples and then what we learned from it. So here are some of my attempts to render the AQI scale using gestures and sounds. And so, for example, at the healthier end of the scale, the green and yellow end, I use kind of small hand and arm gestures. And then as AQI gets more unhealthy, my gestures started to involve my whole body, started to get more spastic and more extreme at the unhealthy end. I also attempted to use my voice to sonically sketch what green might sound like. So here's the green sound. And here's orange. And red. And so as AQI gets worse, the sounds I made got more erratic, but also louder. And even though I didn't do this on purpose, both the sounds and gestures left me more out of breath as the AQI got higher and more extreme. We also experimented with using food and taste to represent the AQI scale. So here's examples of how we did that. We took super different approaches. So on the left, I found foods in my kitchen that matched the colors and then let that guide me into the different taste profiles. Whereas Max imagined a more holistic experience. So a piece of bread that goes from perfectly toasted, smells good, is delicious, to something that is totally crusty and hard and completely inedible and even carcinogenic. So that shows two different approaches, and Max definitely was taking kind of a more holistic, full body experience, even though she was thinking about taste, which led into an even more full body experience. So Max, why don't you tell us about what you envisioned?
Yeah, so my plan was to try to create a multisensory immersive experience. And so imagine that there is essentially like a row of rooms. In each room, there's going to be a different AQI level and also a different main pollutant. So you walk through the first room, and there's projections of trees, and it smells really luscious and green, like wet soil and exotic florals. And it's warm and humid, as if my coziest flannel blanket is wrapped around me. And I hear birds, sounds of little animals, and maybe some leaves rustling. And I take a deep breath. And it's replenishing and healing, and my mind is clear. But then I walk through the next room. The main point is ozone. And the air is dry and thick, and it smells like burning wire. But I don't even know where it's coming from. There's no metal or human artifacts in sight. And I take a shallow breath, and I cough midway through, and I feel really dizzy. So that was my attempt at a multisensory experience, essentially envisioning how to intuitively experience the data.
Yeah, so these are some of the lessons that we learned through these multisensory explorations. And the first is that we really reflected on aspects of the data set that we may have overlooked had we were just making visualizations. For example, the implications of using a quasi-categorical scale to represent AQI. This was useful because it allowed us to say, imagine a discrete set of gestures or a discrete set of rooms that you might walk through, but it also caused us to reflect on how this kind of categorical scale is limiting. So does an AQI of 99 really feel so different from that of 101? Maybe not. Which brings us to the second learning here, which is considering the relationship between the data and our bodies and our lived experience. Our sensory representations were things that were meant to be felt viscerally. So things like physical gestures or the act of walking through a room. These things require breath, they require movement, they require you to use your body, which really got us reflecting on how air quality impacts breathing and the rest of our lived experience. So with that, we wanted to leave you with some challenges or future directions for multisensory data representation as we move forward. So these are kind of open questions that we want to continue to explore. So Max, what's the first challenge that we're considering?
Yeah, one of the first challenges is that while data visualization has well-established set of Gestalt rules, so how we perceive visuals to belong to the same group, maybe by having the same hue, or a different one, like an outlier being farther away from a different group, like on a scatter plot, for example. But we don't really have this for multisensory data. So for example, how could we represent a sequential scale in smell other than just adjusting the smell's intensity? Basically, like, what are intuitive ways that we can recognize data in these sensory differences?
And along those lines, we also are still figuring out what kinds of data set are most appropriate for which sensory modalities. So some actually go together quite well, like time series data and sound are a natural fit. But what kinds of data lend themselves best to smell or to taste or to textures? Or when we think about a type of data like, say, a network graph data set, what sensory modality would best represent that? So this is one of the questions that we hope to continue exploring. Also, because Max and I, as we collaborated on this project, we lived in different cities, sometimes even we were on different continents, we faced the challenge of how to share these sensory experiences. So we can't very easily just slap a taste onto a postcard and drop it into the mail, or send an email with a smell file attachment. So we had to come up with workarounds for how to share these sensory experiences. So we relied heavily on things like written descriptions, on videos, right? We used a lot of animations and animated GIFs, but there's a huge opportunity here to develop better tools for documenting and sharing multisensory experiences remotely.
And finally, as a former linguist, this is a challenge that I'm especially fascinated by. It's the role of language in understanding a sensory experience. Because every person's sensory experience varies according to their environment, background, and personal histories. So in the Western world, we tend to value visual metaphors and focus on sight over sound or smell, for example. So we might say it sounds like a plastic bag, essentially using visual cues or maybe contextual cues that would jog memory, but we're not really distilling or describing the sound of a plastic bag itself. Or we might limit ourselves to good or bad, like it smells good, it smells bad. So one example I have is when I was doing a sensory walk in Paris and I was trying to log all the scents I smelled. Well, I smelled probably like 5 to 10 different floral perfumes. And I was so frustrated because I didn't have a way to describe the differences between these floral perfumes. It was just another floral perfume or sickly sweet or yeah, or more bitter. That was probably my best description. But other cultures might have a larger vocabulary of sounds or textures that are used in everyday life. And I'm interested in tapping in on these and also seeing what a human's sensory range could be.
So as we continue to address these challenges with multisensory data representation moving forward, we invite you to do this with us because it's going to take more people contributing all of those different perspectives. So here's some ways that you can get involved with this project. Coming up in May at the CHI conference, we're going to be holding a hands-on workshop, and it'll be virtual, so you can participate from anywhere, all about how we might sketch in the different sensory modalities to represent data sets. And so you can find out how to sign up for that at sensorysketching.com.
And in the meantime, if you want to learn more, we've been writing a newsletter that documents these different exercises and learnings from this. And it also contains some exercises that you can do and maybe like submit to us or give us your feedback if you like.
And so in that theme of multisensory exercises, we wanted to leave you with one final activity that you can all try at home. So this is something you can do during the live Q&A session or just anytime in the future. We've set up a collaborative workspace, a mural, at bit.ly/datathesenses activity, And there we have a data set that we can all work with. And it actually comes from the Data Visualization Society's annual State of the Industry survey. So for the first step, take a look at that data set, get to know it, think about how you might analyze it or an insight that you might draw from it. And then step 2 is to brainstorm how you might represent one of those insights or takeaways or analyses in a various sensory modalities. So we challenge you to pick something that you don't normally work with. So if you normally work in visuals, maybe pick taste or sound or texture, and you can add your brainstorm to that mural. And we'll be checking in on those during the Q&A and later, because we're really curious what ideas you all have. So with that, we really look forward to your questions, and we thank you for watching our talk.
Thank you.